Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us. We've waited 2 years for this report, the Forde Report. We're discussing tonight if it was worth the wait. It's certainly nice to see that the Jewish labor movement is fuming that they and their training are being mildly criticized. That could be a show, but it's still nice to see it. And indeed, there have also been some interesting nuggets confirming what many of us knew what was going on anyway. Either right in the key positions of bureaucratic power in the Labour Party were scheming against the elected leader of the party. However, I don't think there was really a need to bury its publication on the hottest day of the year, because it is a very even-handed report and blaming throughout factions on both sides, which we're going to discuss a little with Asa Winstanley. I think we should say from the outset that the leaked report was indeed factional. And this is about the leaked report that was put out by those around Jeremy Corbyn after he was deposed. And this report the leaked report was trying to show that the Corbyn leadership took allegations of anti-Semitism in the party extremely seriously, too seriously, one might argue, but was hindered in its efforts to clean up the party by the old regime of Ian McNicol, who dragged his feet in order to oust and smear Corbyn. The leaked report goes into a great length of how Lotto, the leader of the opposition's office, tried to get rid of some people like Chris Williamson and Jackie Walker and many others accused of anti-Semitism, which I believe was a massive, critical mistake made by the Corbyn leadership. We're not here, and we should say it from the outset because we're getting those kind of criticisms a lot, we're not here to trash Jeremy Corbyn. All of the speakers tonight joined the party because of Corbyn or campaigned for him, and certainly support the call to have the whip reinstated to him. But we need to be honest about what went wrong. And the campaign to claim that the Labour Party had a serious problem with anti-Semitism was incredibly successful. It's now a given that was true. Forde, in his report, for example, simply accepts as a given that there was a profoundly serious issue of anti-Semitism in the party, and that the problem within parts of the party was clearly of major significance. And we're looking at this issue later in the show with Tony Greenstein. But how important is to learn some lessons about this is the fact that just today, NEC candidate Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi of Jewish Voice for Labour has been dumped by Momentum, including by some reps from the new Momentum organisers. This shows that the witch hunt on the left, against the left, is still alive and well, and there are still huge lessons to be learned. Hence our meeting tonight with a range of speakers who have a lot to say on this issue. First, we want to speak to Asa Winstanley of the Electronic Intifada. Hi, Asa. Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
You have written a lot about the Corbyn years. So in your opinion, the report claiming that both sides were as bad as each other, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to identify that as the overall tenor of this latest report this week. It's kind of trying to seek this sort of false balance, really. Well, I suppose we should be fair and start with the positives of the report first, if I could. And I think that, to me, I'm still working my way through it. I'm trying to read it in detail, but I think that, to me, my initial impression is there are elements of it that are, I have to admit, quite good. And I think that that actually the Labour Party right won't be pleased about. And we have seen some sort of, I would say, tempered criticism of it by the Jewish Labour movement, for example. The pro-Israel Labour Party right-wing group in the Labour Party that we're all familiar with. And the reason for that is because of the parts of it where it does admit that anti-Semitism was weaponized by the Labour Party right. Now, of course, as you've said, unfortunately, it tries to sort of balance that and says that both sides were doing it. I mean, and this is frankly ridiculous. So the part I've got here, it says on page 13, some anti-Corbyn elements of the party seized on anti-Semitism as a way to attack Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters. As a way to attack Jeremy Corbyn, and his supporters saw it as simply as an attack on the leader and his faction, with both sides thus weaponizing the issue and failing to recognize the seriousness of anti-Semitism. So, I mean, this is frankly ridiculous, to be frank, because it's trying to say that both sides were as guilty of weaponizing anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, that does fall into the kind of rhetoric of when we saw a few years ago Ruth Smeeth at a JLM conference said that the only people guilty of weaponizing anti-Semitism are the anti-Semites, by which he means, of course, people who criticize Israel on the right wing of the Labour Party. So, like, it's an interesting document. Like, it tries to kind of both sides an issue of, it's kind of at odds with its own evidence. Its conclusions are at odds with its own evidence, I would say.
Playing up. I was going to show us a few slides on this issue, actually, because it is this factionalism on both sides is a distraction. We found little evidence of mutual respect and a great deal of evidence of factionalism, and which kind of implies, of course, there were two factions. Totally ignores the fact that one was the elected leader of the Labour Party and had a duty, or the responsibility to change things in the party, and was undermined by the bureaucracy.
And they're also showing and displaying a complete, I mean, at best we could say, if we want to be generous to the Forde Report panel, which wasn't just Martin Forde, but if we want to be generous to them, we could say it's a complete misunderstanding of how power works, because throughout this report, they're trying to present themselves as the kind of adults in the room. They're trying to present themselves as these apolitical, sort of jurists who are, dispassionately evaluating the evidence. And that inevitably means that, therefore, according to them, that there will be problems on both sides, and that this false idea of both sides being as equally to blame as possible. Well, this is nonsense. Of course, the panel included Labour Party peers, they are not independent of the Labour Party, and they are not, of course they're going to want to ingratiate themselves to Keir Starmer. And this kind of both sidesing of the issue of the weaponizing of anti-Semitism is just really completely unrealistic, A, but also B, it quite cleverly plays into Starmer's agenda, because he's always wanted to present himself as, I'm bringing the Labour Party together. Factionalism was a problem in the past, by which he means under Jeremy Corbyn, but now, I'm bringing the party together. Well, we've all seen how that has worked in the Labour Party over the last 3 years. It's been a complete and utter defeat of the Labour Party left, and a massive purge of the Labour Party left by the Labour Party right. And the Labour Party right says this openly. Labour List has declared a few years ago that, I believe it was when Rebecca Long Bailey was sacked from the shadow front bench, that it's the complete victory of the Labour Party right, and they're just saying it openly. So this pretense of both sidesing it is really nonsensical.
There's also, I mean, he explains that £135,000 was converted by a proper operation to anti-Corbyn MPs. But, as you can see the little box there, it seems to us the approach of both sides to resource allocation was coloured by factional concerns. So they all made mistakes.
Yeah, this is really interesting. This is one of the more interesting findings, because, I mean, we did see this in the leaked report, but this is far more. I mean, if I remember correctly, this is £135,000 is far more than was revealed in the leaked report. So it shows, the extent of this, and also, that quote about, but again, they're both sides in this. It was only one side trying to do this, and also, who were those diversions going to? They were going to the right-wing MPs who were actively sabotaging the party. People like Joan Ryan of Labour Friends of Israel at the time, and Wes Streeting, the most right-wing Labour MPs, who were openly writing, they were removing the Labour Party logo from their election leaflets and so forth. And they were saying things like, they were basically saying in their election publicity to their local constituents, saying, well, vote for me, but I don't want Jeremy Corbyn to win. So they were actively sabotaging their own party, and this is what Forde has not got to grips with. To say that hasn't made a difference is just nonsensical.
Yeah. I mean, he does actually criticize in parts. There's some issues where he does criticize it, like the validation process, it's called, which was the process of weeding out supporters of Corbyn in the 2015 and 2016 election. And he does say that it seems credible to suggest that the exercise was not targeted of what we're saying, there's proof that this validation process was done against the left. But on the other hand, we don't believe that this proves, there was an effort to kick out Corbyn supporters. So he does a lot of, on the one hand, but on the other hand, we don't find this was particularly serious. We learn in the process, actually, which I don't think we knew either, that there were almost 2,000 so-called flagged phrases with which they automatically trolled social media accounts, leading to 4,000 total actions by the NEC, which includes all supporter rejections, membership rejections, auto-exclusion, and administrative suspensions, which is quite a lot, 4,000.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another thing that comes through very clearly in this report. Again, to its credit, I have to admit, the extent to which not only was the 2017 election campaign sabotaged by the Labour Party staff and Labour Party right, but also the 2015 and 2016 leadership campaigns were vastly tilted against Jeremy Corbyn, and I think he documented in one of the leadership campaigns that there was at least 3,000 people that they basically kicked out of the party because they suspected them of wanting to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Now, we've known this for years, but so again, that's a kind of validation of us, but it's really too little, too late. I think it is. I mean, just before we were coming on live, Tony was describing it as a very clever report, and I agree with that. I think that it's you can tell it's written by lawyers. A jurist in this case, or as the leader of the panel. It's a smart document. They have to put in a certain amount of that to make it even remotely credible, because the evidence has been out there for us all to see for years. Yeah. Nonetheless, this is a Labour Party endorsed document, and so it does give a kind of institutional validation, I suppose, to it.
This is probably my favorite screenshot, C2.31, which said, this validation process was clearly a factually slanted exercise with the goal of undermining Jeremy Corbyn's chances, but that this witch hunt allowed the false idea that complaints of some anti-Semitism were being fabricated as part of a witch hunt. So in the same paragraph, it's totally, saying the opposite. So there was a witch hunt, yes, but then that gave rise to it being called a witch hunt. I mean, this is like being expelled for saying there was a witch hunt, isn't it? Exactly.
That's exactly it, Tina. You're right. Like he's at war with his own evidence. I mean, and they start off. He starts off straight away in this report, just saying that there's another section of it on page 15. They say the leaked report expressly rejects the suggestion that the problem of anti-Semitism in the party was overstated or that allegations of anti-Semitism were part of a smear campaign. Indeed, there is nothing in the leaked report or elsewhere in the evidence we have seen that would support such conclusions. Now, if that was generally the conclusion they've reached, they've not been looking. They've simply not been looking. They're taking it as a given that there was a unique problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party when all the evidence, the documentary evidence, points to the opposite, that there was, yes, of course, there can be some cases on the left of anti-Semitism. The left is not immune to racism. It can happen. But this whole manufactured campaign that we've seen over the last 7 years of this really kind of mass hysteria that there is a uniquely vicious and endemic problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and the left wing of the Labour Party especially, is never, ever been supported by the evidence. And and that was really the problem with the main problem with the leaked document by these ostensibly pro-Corbyn Labour staffers. They took that as a given, and they're taking the approach that basically any accusation of anti-Semitism is essentially evidence. They don't get to grips with any of the evidence, really, in all the high-profile so-called cases of anti-Semitism. And Forde just starts with that as the assumption, well, there is a problem of anti-Semitism, a unique problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And that's what really fundamentally undermines it.
In a sentence or two, what's your key lesson that you take from not just the Forde Report, but perhaps the 7 years that went on before?
Israel and its lobby and its supporters in the UK and around the world are going to continue weaponizing the issue of anti-Semitism, and they're going to keep on doing it. And there's no brushing that under the carpet. It can't be ignored. It can only be defeated, and it's not. I don't think it's that hard to defeat. But once you start giving an inch, they're going to take more than a mile, and that's what's been done. Unfortunately, as you said before, we did support Jeremy Corbyn's project. I'm still very sympathetic to him, but we have to admit, frankly, that the Labour left strategy of appeasement of the issue of weaponizing of anti-Semitism was a complete and total failure, and it just exacerbated the problem. And this is an issue that's not going away, as we've seen. And I think if we could take anything positive from the Forde Report, there has now been an admission, a reluctant admission, that the Labour Party right did weaponize anti-Semitism. That is the word the Forde Report used. It was used as a weapon by both sides, but that includes the right. So that's something to take from it.
Absolutely, and it's a shame to say, but the fate of Naomi now being dumped by Momentum shows how that witch hunt is still continuing, and people want to. Yeah,
I'm sorry to hear that. That's breaking news to me, and I'm very sorry to hear that they've done that to Naomi. Unfortunately, it's no surprise from Momentum, an organisation which has just thrown people under the bus time after time, and they seem to be carrying on the same traditions.
Which is why we carry on talking about it, because it is a cancer on the left, I think, what we're doing to our own comrades. Thank you very much, Asa, for joining us. Thank you. I'm now being joined by Kevin Bean, who's one of the Merseyside 4 who were expelled last year, I think it's last year, and is also a member of the steering committee of the Labour Left Alliance. Kevin, this report makes a number of recommendations for cultural growth, which I thought was quite entertaining, because he talks about deep listening, and we need to learn from each other, etc. And in theory is right, but it looks like very much what the Daily Mail might describe as a woke way forward. For example, the authors conducted a roundtable discussion with people from the right and the left to talk about how we should talk to each other, etc. I get the idea he does not really understand the nature of the Labour Party that well.
Yeah, just by way of small correction, Wavertree 4, not Merseyside 4.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's important because it was linked to the constituency, and particularly the issue of both our past MP and our current MP. But anyway, I don't really want to talk about that. Yeah, I think it really comes on from what Asa has said at the beginning, and this is that the report is in many ways both quite consciously even-handed, but it actually avoids many of the main issues, and it does nothing to dispel the the smearing, and I'm afraid I'm going to use fairly direct language, that that all sorts of activists who were suspended or expelled, faced. I still get I still get sort of comments about this even years later. So I think the report doesn't really dispel that, although it sort of talks about factionalism, and although it talks about the way, that there was good and bad on both sides and so on. What it does, as comrades have said already, is not to sort of really go to the root of the matter. And I think the root of the matter isn't about listening or culture. This is not some sort of therapy session. This is not the sort of, mindfulness that you might get in certain forms of education. This is about politics. And what it does, I think in particular, is to, avoid the issue of the nature of the Labour Party, and in particular the attacks from the right on the left, which the smears were a very important part. And comrades are right to make the point about the role of Israel and about those issues in particular. But there's also, I think, another issue which is rooted in British politics, and what we might loosely call the Corbyn project, the mass movement of people. And this really put the fear of God into the Labour right, but not just into the Labour right as a faction, but actually into the ruling class. And the point about the Labour right is it's not just another faction. It's the Parliamentary Labour Party. It has intimate connections with the British state, and indeed the Labour Party leadership historically has functioned in that way. So this report comes from a very different sort of place to, I think, any of the comrades here. It sees it as a cultural problem. Maybe we need to improve the way that we talk to each other. We need to perhaps be more respectful. It's not about that. This was really a struggle for power. It was, in fact, very much a sort of one-sided civil war. And when you began, Tina, when you said, we must sort of be clear about who's responsible for this. Well, obviously the Labour right launched the attacks, but as we've seen, with what happened to Naomi, today, the soft left, the so-called left, joined in, and I include in that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. I don't want to talk about particular cases, but I know enough comrades who were hung out to dry by the left leadership, and indeed by Momentum, and indeed by other lefts who joined in, partly on the grounds of there's no smoke without fire, but also I think in the idea that you can placate and appease the Labour right. And there was never any chance of that happening. That there shouldn't be any chance of that happening, because they're not just comrades who've got sort of differences of opinion. They're actually, I think quite clear pro-capitalist elements in the party. And if we want to expel anybody, it's people like that, not, good socialists and good, working class comrades. On this call, there'll be many comrades with whom I have disagreements, but I recognize them as sort of genuine socialists. I don't recognize the people who launch these attacks and these smears as actually having any place in our movement.
And referring to John McDonnell in particular, I think the report, and that's why I brought that picture up, he like a teacher with the naughty school children, he tells off people from those in most senior positions on both sides fail to treat healing the factional rift as a priority. Whereas, we might say that actually John McDonnell in particular did quite enough of that, if not too much, bending over backwards to the right.
Yeah, and I think the tone of the report, which I really commend Asa for his detailed work on it, and I'm sure Tony will be the same in their presentations. I've read it, but what strikes me is its tone. It does remind me of, because it's the school holidays, there might be many parents here who understand this. It reminds me of a bunch of squabbling children in the backyard who you come out and say, now play nicely, everybody, stop squabbling. And that sort of culture runs all the way through this. And, just to reiterate what comrades have been saying already, because I think we have to be careful. This is a very well constructed report, and there is enough in it. I mean, it makes a Guardian editorial seem like a clumsy exercise in fence sitting. It should really be, you know, a model. And, you know, it does deserve very close analysis, which I'm glad comrades have been doing. Perhaps we should set it as an A-level, an undergraduate text to deconstruct.
An MA, I think, could be done on this.
Yeah.
He also recommends a code of conduct should be written. And this is briefly this is quite interesting. What he says should be in that code of conduct. The joint statement of the Joe Cox Foundation, as well as elements of Labour to Win statement on cultural change, etc., which also I think shows you actually it's slanted quite to the right. You know, there should be a code of conduct, and we sort of ask the right what they want to do, and that sort of gives the impression as well. You know, if you don't stick to it and you don't adhere to it, you know, then it's right to kick you out.
Yeah, I'm always suspicious of codes of conduct, because they not only seem to go one way, but they seem more often to be designed to close down any sort of debate or any sort of discussion. And you know, freedom of speech, freedom of discussion in the Labour movement is absolutely vital, as is freedom to recall MPs and to criticise them. You know, much of the so-called anti-Semitism was often criticisms of MPs for particular policy positions they took, and as soon as they were criticised, they claimed that this was an anti-Semitic attack. So codes of conduct, other than the normal healthy traditions of the Labour movement, I think are superfluous. And when they're introduced, as they are in many other areas of life, they're designed to restrict discussion, restrict ideas. And, you know, the so-called charge of denialism, which is what led to my suspension, was simply that, you know, any comrade who questions the arguments of leadership is then deemed to be in denial and therefore ipso facto anti-Semitic.
We're going to talk about that with Tony Greenstein in a little while.
Sorry, I'm sure Tony's got plenty of examples of that.
He does. Yeah. One last issue I was going to talk to you about is this, which I quite liked. You know, it's be kind to each other. It's a huge thing in the report. You know, we need to listen to each other. It's foundational to all successful progressive movements. Be kind. And then it mentions, but not, you know, those who call themselves communists or Trotskyists. It's quite right that they're being kicked out. And it also talks about the proscribed organizations. It's a bit unhappy. He's a bit unhappy. He has got concerns about how that was done. But he says, you know, it's quite right that a party should be able to proscribe organizations. Doesn't make any criticism of the retrospectives application of that. But this I found interesting, because it doesn't, it's not just any, you know, about somebody who's in a communist party, but it's any communist or Trotskyist shouldn't be in the Labour Party.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that this is quite an interesting area, because it's one that wasn't actually, you know, really very prominent to the fore. I think anti-Semitism was really the main focus of the right's attack. But I think it is an important issue, and it goes back to the point I've just made about freedom for discussion and for political debate. You know, the history of the Labour Party, its foundation was as a federation of different tendencies and currents. There were Fabians and there were Marxists, there were trade unionists. Comrades know this, particularly if they've had to put up with our LLA education sessions for the last couple of years. But I think what this is attempting to do is to close down political discussion and debate. But my argument would be that all socialist tendencies should not only be allowed to be individual members of the party, but actually should affiliate. In other words, that we shouldn't have prescriptions, or indeed, if we're going to have a prescription, we just prescribe those who are pro-capitalist. In other words, if we're a working class organization, all members of the working class, all members of working class organizations and socialist and communist supporters should be able to join the party. That it's an important aspect of the tradition of our movement, and it was not a major part of the witch hunt, but it was used on occasions. And I think that it is something that we should bring to the fore, because what the right has done is not only to exclude working class militants who identify as Marxists, it's excluded even just general oppositionists, or indeed people who just ask questions. So any sort of critical approach, is a ground for prescription. So the idea of prescription, the idea of closing down debate, which is what the Labour right, the pro-capitalist, the pro-state Labour right want, and I think something we have to fight, and to continue to fight against.
Yes. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm going to now talk to Tony a little bit about the key issue, which is, of course, the anti-Semitism. Hi, Tony.
Yeah. Hi.
I'm going to show an interesting snippet again. It is full of interesting snippets, so I do urge comrades to read the thing. It's long, but it is interesting. So this point E3.5 I think he's trying to say something quite different, but in that, he's saying you shouldn't force Jews to come out against Israel. That's anti-Semitism, forcing Jews to say particularly, what they think about Israel. Fair enough. But in this, he says, it is, of course, acceptable for party discussions to include criticisms of the government of Israel or any other state when it is perceived to have acted in an oppressive or discriminatory way. Has he not paid attention to what's been going on in the Labour Party? This is exactly what people have been expelled for and are still being expelled for, criticizing Israel. Is he just being ignorant, or is it worse?
Well, it's worse than that, really, because it completely ignores the context of criticism of Israel. Firstly, Israel isn't just like another state, another bourgeois state. Israel is the world's only apartheid state, and it's an apartheid state which claims it as a Jewish state. And those who weaponized anti-Semitism, the Jewish labor movement and the Border Deputies, are explicitly pro-Zionist. The Border Deputies claim to speak on behalf of all Jews, and yet it is it has support for Israel in its constitution. So it's inevitable that when they speak, they will tar by association all Jews. And that is where the idea that if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic comes from. So it completely ignores that context. And, I doubt if there's one single Palestine solidarity activist in Britain who hasn't been accused of anti-Semitism. It's the first thing that supporters of Israel say, and it's understandable, because how else do you defend confiscation of land, demolition of homes, administrative detention, and all the other ills that Israel visits on the Palestinians? So it's completely beside the point, and it actually assumes that Jewish people will be discomforted, whereas in fact probably the majority of Jewish people in the Labour Party under Corbyn were not supporters of Israel. That is the reality, and that is what is ignored. The Jewish Labour movement calls the Israeli Labour Party its own sister party, and it was Omar Bar-Lev, who was the security minister in the recent coalition, who allowed a pogrom to go through East Jerusalem. They're tied hand and foot to a racist Israeli party, the very party that was responsible for the Nakba. So to claim that they're somehow a Jewish representative organization is in itself to fall into that trap. Yeah, it's completely beside the point. And it ignores everything else about the anti-Semitism witch hunt, doesn't it? For example, the fact that if you're Jewish, you're more than 5 times more likely to be expelled today for anti-Semitism. So it doesn't mention that. It doesn't
tend to be anti-Zionist Jews in the Labour Party.
If you're Jewish and not a Zionist, then really you don't count. And that is the problem with this report. It's completely decontextualized.
Yeah. I was going to speak to you a little bit about this denialism, which I think for the first time we're getting a bit of a definition of it by Mr. Forde. So he describes how over 1,100 submissions. And he says, they're all detailing their experiences of anti-Semitism, and then in brackets, along with other forms of racism, sexism, homophobia, and denialism. So that's all in the same category of wrongdoing. The frequent evidence of denialism in relation to a seriousness of problem of anti-Semitism. And here's the definition. For the avoidance of doubt, the complete denialism is not the complete denial that anti-Semitism was an issue in the party. It's questioning that it was a serious issue in the party. So you're allowed to, you're not allowed to say it wasn't a huge problem. That is denialism, which I hadn't quite seen in such a stark definition.
Well, I mean, it's amazing. Firstly, it says it received 1,100 submissions.
1,100.
1,100.
Sorry, 1,100. Yes, you're
yeah.
Right.
Presumably, many of them alleged that they had been the recipients of anti-Semitism. Why? Because the JLM mobilised its members to write in and say they'd been victims of anti-Semitism. They weren't cross-examined as to what that anti-Semitism was. That is not evidence because it hasn't been tested in any forum. I mean, we saw from the Is Labour's Anti-Semitic Panorama report that all the people who gave evidence there, and they spoke, of having heard Labour members at meetings say there was no Holocaust, they were never tested and never questioned. They were liars. And yet people who lie, and Zionists do lie frequently, almost all the time, in fact, it's treated as evidence. So it's absolutely absurd. But, the problem was that Jeremy Corbyn bought into this idea that if you deny it, you're part of the problem. It's like someone is accused of a serious criminal offence. They go to court and then they plead not guilty. And then the judge then says, well, the fact that you pleaded not guilty is, to me, proof that you are guilty. That's what denialism is. It's completely topsy-turvy. It reverses the burden of proof. What's interesting about this report, and is interesting about the Labour Leak report and so on, is that no one ever provides any factual evidence of the anti-Semitism. It's missing. It's just assumed. And the reason for that is because it doesn't exist. And that's why they had to redefine what anti-Semitism was. They called it the IHRA. So anti-Semitism now became hostility or criticism of Israel. It was no longer hatred or hostility to Jews because they were Jews, which is a very simple and obvious definition of anti-Semitism that everybody understands.
No, it's very important
to redefine it. There is a problem, isn't there?
No. Interestingly, the report does not mention Chris Williamson, although the term denialism, the charge of denialism, was kind of invented for him, wasn't it? He didn't actually do anything wrong. He just stood with the wrong crowd and denied it was a huge problem. So
and not only Chris Williamson, the report doesn't mention Marc Wadsworth either. And what was probably the most outrageous of the expulsions, it doesn't even mention, except in passing, Jackie Walker. So all the outrageous cases which were used to prove anti-Semitism, it doesn't mention me either. So, I mean, basically, it just skirts over the most egregious cases. And the real problem is that Jeremy Corbyn went along with it. If I can just quote from the Labour leaked report to give the example, it says on page 306, Jeremy Corbyn himself and members of his staff team requested to GLEU, that is the compliance unit, that particular anti-Semitism cases be dealt with. In 2017, Lotto, leader of the opposition staff, chased for action on high-profile anti-Semitism cases Ken Livingstone, Tony Greenstein, Jackie Walker and Marc Wadsworth, stressing that these cases were of great concern to Jewish stakeholders. I wonder who they were, and that resolving them was essential to, quote, rebuilding trust between the Labour Party and the Jewish community, unquote. Well, they did expel us. It wasn't actually for anti-Semitism and all sorts of pretexts, but it wasn't that. Did they rebuild trust? No, they came for more people. The more people you expel, the more people they wanted you to expel. At the end, they were expelling them so quickly. I mean, there was no room for anything, but did that help them? No. They were savage at the 2019 general election with the chief rabbi and all the rest. The JLN didn't even support the Labour Party. So appeasement, if you appease your enemy, it never works.
Absolutely. I'm going to show one more clip to you and see what you think about that. Which is, we've seen, says Mr. Forde, we've seen no evidence that claims of anti-Semitism were fabricated by complainants or improperly pursued by the complaints team. No evidence, apparently.
But I don't think they looked for the evidence, did they?
Probably.
Because if they had looked for it, they would have found it. They would have found it in Jackie Walker's case. There was no evidence. In Marc Wadsworth's case, there was no anti-Semitism there. In fact, Ruth Smead later retracted it by removing stuff from her website. In my case, they didn't even allege anti-Semitism. You know, I mean, Ken Livingstone, he simply referred to something which is a fact. So there you are. They've already ignored that evidence. And there were hundreds of people who, because they made a comment about Israel, were expelled for anti-Semitism. So if they didn't see the fabrication of complaints, it's because they never looked for that evidence. And if they had looked for it, they would have found it in buckets.
Yeah. Also interesting here, that last sentence I've highlighted. The leaked report itself is emphatic in stating that it thoroughly disproves any suggestion that anti-Semitism is not a problem in the party, or that it is all a smear or a witch hunt, which is, of course, points to the problem we've been talking about, is that the Corbyn leadership did bend over backwards to try and show it's doing everything in its power. I mean, I should say, I think somebody put in the chat, you said there was no anti-Semitism at all in the party. I don't think that's what you're saying, actually.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm sure there were individuals in the party, very few. There were two examples, I think, of Holocaust deniers in the leaked report. Out of 600,000 people, that's not a great many, is it, to be quite honest? But the analogy I always use is that, of course, there will be some paedophiles in the party. Out of 600,000, statistically, you're bound to have it. But did anyone say that paedophilia was a problem? No, that's a narrative. Yeah. Of course, there are anti-Semites, few and far between, but there were a few. But it wasn't a problem with anti-Semitism. I mean, I'm bringing out a new book on Zionism during the Holocaust, and it will show that anti-Semitism amongst the Labour right really was a problem. And in the wartime coalition government, the Home Office, Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, he refused thousands of requests for admission to Britain of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, from Vichy France in particular. And he was anti-Semitic. And those people were deported to Auschwitz. So the anti-Semitism of the right was a real problem. There's no such equivalent on the left. But the Board of Deputies didn't complain about Morrison because it didn't want them coming here either.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be said. I mean, as co-chair of Labour Against the Witch Hunt, I did see a lot of evidence, and I've seen a lot of confusion by people when they often sometimes talked about Jews instead of Israel, and there was confusion rather than, I think, hardcore anti-Semitism.
But that's not anti-Semitism. That's, as you say, confusion. I mean, if the Board of Deputies claims to speak on behalf of all Jews, and then it defends Israel right or wrong, is it any wonder that some people fall for it? We have to educate them, of course, but that's not anti-Semitism. It just means they're politically not, if you like, sophisticated. But the responsibility for that is the Zionists, who always claim that they represent Jews and no one else.
Indeed. What's your key lesson in a couple of sentences?
Well, the first thing, this is a very clever report. I mean, Martin Forde is not a QC for nothing. He's an intelligent man, and he's probably a far better QC than Keir Starmer, incidentally. So he's constructed a report that will be much harder for the left to critique than if Keir Starmer had written it, because it does look at things and balances things. But the problem is, as I think Desmond Tutu said, that neutrality in the face of oppression is actually taking the side of the oppressor. And that's what Forde has done. He has actually taken the side of Starmer by putting forward a relatively balanced report, because he hasn't called out those who were the ones who weaponized anti-Semitism, and the left never did that, whereas the right did that. But I have to say, when they talk of factionalism, I mean, the problem with the left under Corbyn was they weren't factional. They should have been factional, and they should have fought the right instead of appeasing it. When Corbyn abandoned open selection, he basically gave a carte blanche to the right to do what they did. And that's the lesson, if you like.
Indeed. Do you think Starmer is quite happy with this report? Can he use it as a, I mean, was there a need to bury it on the hottest day of the year?
Well, I don't suppose he's over happy with it, because Starmer is, contrary to what people's impressions, he's not terribly bright, and therefore any criticism he will take personally. So I don't suppose he's that happy, but people who are brighter and more intelligent than Starmer will realise that Martin Forde has actually done them a service.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, Tina.
Stay here if you can. We are trying to get back to everybody after the initial discussion. I'm going to show a little video now with Leah Levane, who can't be here tonight but wanted to contribute, which is very good of her. We've been talking about the education program by the Jewish labor movement. As we've seen, they've been quite unhappy about being criticized in the Forde Report. And although it's quite a soft criticism actually, but we've been talking about that training. Here it is. Welcome to Leah Levane, member of the officers group of the Jewish Voice for Labour, which gets one mention in the report, in the Forde Report, on the question of education. The Forde Report describes a refusal to engage at all with Jewish Voice for Labour's proposals for anti-Semitism education, and that CLPs are, we're told, not even allowed to enlist their help. It was a bit worse than that, wasn't it?
Jewish Voice for Labour is vilified and called the most terrible names, of which probably the most polite is sham Jewish, anti-Semitism denying. Lee Harpin, I can't remember, he certainly used to work for the Jewish Chronicle, actually tweeted, the whole JVL and JLM thing is something that many, understandably, fail to get to grips with. Still get national newspaper journos asking me, who are the good / bad ones? Really? I mean, the first response is, good Jews and bad Jews? Are you really going there? But yes, in terms of education, a criticism of the training, the so-called training that is being used, very, very didactic. Jewish people from our education group, in at least one case, being told that when your suspension is over, you'll only be readmitted when you've undertaken the training, this training that's been criticized so heavily by Forde. What Forde says, and we totally agree with, is that the way to deal with any forms of, bad behavior, and certainly around the protected characteristics, which he does focus on, is education, time for reflection, and recognizing, yes, there are, that people have to be allowed to grow.
And he's criticizing not just the form of the education, top down, etc., but surprisingly a little bit also the content, and saying there are different views.
Actually, and that's where JVL comes in. And we've never said our view is the only one that counts. Jeremy Corbyn's advisor on faith groups said they were going to organize a roundtable discussion for the Jewish groups. And would we be willing to come? We said, of course we would. We had the date. The Board of Deputies, the Jewish Labour Movement, etc., heard that we'd been invited, refused to attend. And so the meeting didn't happen. In my view, it should have happened with whoever wanted to come.
What I thought was interesting is that he does actually state zero tolerance disciplinary approach is not a good way to go, which actually goes against what the Corbyn leadership did as well, didn't it?
Huge pressure on this zero tolerance. And I see it in many, many spheres, not just in terms of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It is not the way to change people's thinking. As we've often said, because we get accused of being anti-Semitism denialists, which I'm not happy with how that's been written up, but we've never denied anti-Semitism. We've never denied that there's anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And we've never even denied that there are some heinous examples that are not just clumsy wording, and there are some people who need to be booted out. But on the whole, we know what they're looking for. We know that they're searching for things, and they're finding some people who talk about Israel and Palestine in clumsy ways. And there was one of the one of the bits of interference was someone saying, hang on, this person, maybe it wasn't ideal, but they actually talk about Israel and they don't mention Jews or Judaism. I know we don't have the figures for the whole time. The most generous figures I've seen are 0.4% of the membership were accused of anti-Semitism. And let's assume they were all guilty. And also, you know, we can assume they're all guilty, which they probably weren't, but also a context where those are being hunted. You know, I'm sure if you know, it's like anything, if you look for it hard enough, you'll find it. But the reality is they didn't, even with all the searching, they didn't find that much, which still doesn't mean it's not serious. So if they'd been looking for misogyny, if they'd been looking for racism towards Black people, if they'd been looking for Islamophobia, they would have found it. I guess I'm pleased that he has highlighted the perception that there is a hierarchy of racism in the organization. Anti-Black racism, Islamophobia are not treated with the same seriousness, and that's reflected. And the fact that there are no special programs, I think that's an important point to be highlighting. Zero tolerance is really an unhelpful approach. Even if you suspend people temporarily while you talk to people and you support them through growth understanding, if you just have a zero tolerance, it doesn't allow for clumsiness. It doesn't allow any scope for people making a mistake. It doesn't give any possibility for people changing their minds. You probably just confirm them in their views. If you engage in dialogue, you can at the very least sift out quite quickly the people who are genuinely confused, bewildered, don't quite understand what you're getting at, but are willing to learn, and those who are just entrenched and go, no way, no how. And then you make a decision on that basis, not on the basis of the trolling that's gone on.
It's also not a very democratic culture, is it? You know, to have a working class organization. There's lots of different views on all sorts of issues. You know, who's going to say, you know, what's the allowed point of view?
And I think there were a lot of points about the need for culture change that are really, really important.
Well, we're looking forward to JVL's coverage of the report.
Come out bit by bit over the next few days or week or so.
Thank you very much, Leah, for joining us.
Okay.
That was Leah. I think she made some very good points, especially on this zero tolerance issue. Also, the hierarchy of racism, which I want to talk to now with Reederwan Craayenstein, comrade, who is from Labour Black Socialists and an anti-apartheid activist. Hello, comrade. Have you had a chance to read much of the report on the racism section? It does have its own section, doesn't it?
The issue is I have read, and because it has been a well-crafted report, one needs to sit back and think again and again, because the difficulty I have with this report is this is a well-qualified professional who tried to overbalance and push concerns through a cookie cutter to blame both sides. Now that's a ridiculous proposition. There is bureaucratic power that had been used. And when he blames both sides, the factionalists that propagated power are still in charge. So you cannot, it's like the kind of thing that we had in apartheid. We had to forgive the people who murdered us, who took our lives away. And there was no accountability. And this is the problem with this report. It finds every instance, it finds anti-Semitism, and then it says there's a hierarchy of racism. It says anti-Black racism. It is atrocious. The report does not deny the abuse of Diane, of Clive, of Dawn. It does not deny the abuse of Muslims. It does not deny the abuse of GRT people. But in order to be a professional. And the one thing that we do when we become professionals is we develop a professional capacity to become maladjusted to injustice. And this is what this report does. It's a good report, but its overreaching on even-handedness destroys the potential that it could have. And there is the problem. And there is also the difficulty. But it is not impossible to get good things out of the report for the Labour Party. And that is the question. What do we do now that we have the report? And I wonder whether or not the Labour Party that has been fighting a factional war against the left for 2 years. Now, guess what? I'm a Labour Party member and I'm speaking on an LLA platform tonight. Now, if this report means anything, what happens to my membership? Now, for me, that's not a problem because I come from the anti-apartheid struggle. Our organizations were banned all the time. And we did not allow the apartheid government to determine the content of our political commitments. Now, this Forde report says that there were factional battles against Black people, against left-wing Jews, against Muslims, against GRT people. It does not deny it. And Theodore Adorno says, in the search for truth, go where the pain is to find the truth. For me, philosophically and politically, I'm a member of the Labour Party. At the middle of midnight, I could find an email in my inbox. But if truth means anything, I have to follow the wretched of the Labour Party, as Frans Fanon would have called them, the suspended and the expelled. And that's why I'm here.
Yes, very good. Very brave of you, because we are...
and then I say, W.E.B. Du Bois said to Keir Starmer, he holds the power, and Evans who hold the power. You've got to report. W.E.B. Du Bois asked you 4 questions. How shall integrity meet oppression? This report does not deny that there was injustice done in the Labour Party. The question is, what does your moral compass tell you? I won't be long. How does honesty meet deception? The deception was of such an extent that a Labour Party government was prevented from being formed by Labour Party staff members. How does decency face insult? People who are good socialists died with broken hearts.
Comrade, I'm going to bring in Chris Williamson next, because I was going to ask you, do you think, Chris thinks the party is dead and there's no space to fight for it. Do you think there is still a space?
No, sister, I'm a prisoner of hope. But hope as a verb, something that you do, despite the evidence to the contrary, because we have to work inside the Labour Party, because that you cannot abandon Parliament. But the Labour Party is not a vehicle for socialism. At best, it communicates a social democratic project. In order to get a socialist revolution, we have to work outside of Parliament, because Karl Marx did say that you cannot assume control of the instruments of the bourgeois state and put those institutions to revolutionary purposes. Revolution is somewhere else. Social democracy is not a bad thing. Labour Party is at best for that. So the last question is, how does virtue meet brute force? The wretched, the expelled, our brother Chris there, Tony Greenstein, Jackie Walker, Ken Livingstone, Marc Wadsworth, they were not expelled by the ones in office now. We even have to look amongst our own loved ones. So the issue is, if I were Keir Starmer, I would take a leaf from Nelson Mandela on the eve when South Africa could have ended in a bloodbath. Although our compromises went too far. But if he wants to win, and he can win, if he takes a leaf from Nelson Mandela. If he doesn't, the chances are that he has no chance. But they smoke their own weed, these people. They will believe that they can continue this witch hunt. So I've come to Labour Left Alliance knowing that this is like the apartheid government raiding your house in the middle of the night. And the issue is, if this report means anything, they would think twice of suspending me. But guess what? I don't hold my breath. But I know the same person was on the ground facing apartheid security police in the middle of the night is the one who is here, bearing witness to your virtue, to your integrity, to your honesty and your decency. And the day that they treat our brother, Chris Williamson, Ken Livingstone, Jackie Walker, Marc Wadsworth with dignity and respect, then I know the Labour Party has learned something. And then I know it is a party waiting. What is it that Lemmy said the other day? We're a party, we're a government in waiting, and then he draws all the wrong conclusions. So I am here. The report confirms that the Labour Party is institutionally racist. It is institutionally Islamophobic. It has significant problems with anti-Semitism of the Jewish labor movement. That sectarian logic of theirs, that is the problem. So I thank you for the invitation, and I wait for further announcements by 12 o'clock tonight. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you very much coming on, comrade. It's good to know that you're aware of what could happen. We didn't want to trick anybody into coming to speak and then be expelled, but perhaps speaking on a platform is not yet disallowed. Who knows? I think you made some very interesting points, which I'm going to put to Chris now. Thank you very much for joining us, Chris. I know you've been busy and traveling today. I thought Reederwan made a really good point. The Labour Party is not going to deliver socialism. I think as socialists we know that, but it is an arena of the class struggle. And your experiences in the Labour Party clearly showed that. You know, there was the vicious attacks on you and other left-wingers showed that it is, this is where the class struggle was being fought at that particular time. Now it's perhaps the RMT strike. It can go to different arenas, but can we run away from the class struggle? Can we just say, the Labour Party doesn't matter now anymore?
Well, I think we find the class struggle through different forums, not through the Labour Party. I mean, the Labour Party is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And as for the comparison of Sir Keir Starmer with Nelson Mandela, I think a more appropriate comparison might be with P.W. Botha rather than Mandela. But I mean, I think it's in terms of the Forde Report. I mean, I think the left needs to be honest with itself. I mean, we expect the right wing to do what they did. In a sense, it was how the left responded to it that actually was our undoing. the optics left, the soft left, whatever you want to call them, they are really culpable, it seems to me. The Socialist Campaign Group, I've railed about the Socialist Campaign Group over and over again. I mean, they just ran away from the struggle and, didn't walk the walk. They can talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And one of the comments which has been quoted and attributed to me, something I said, was that solidarity is important, really when it's difficult, not just when it's easy. And I think what we see with the Socialist Campaign Group is that they're more interested in solidarity only when it's easy, not when it's slightly more difficult to actually show it. Actually, Tina, I think my battery's about to run out. So if I just dip out, it's not that I'm being rude, it's that my battery's about to give up the ghost.
No worries. You've seen in the report, perhaps, I mean, you're not mentioned by name, but it does talk about denialism, which is, we now learn, is not denying that there's anti-Semitism, it's denying that it's a huge problem. Did they invent that just for you, to your knowledge, or was that?
Well, I think that what Forde has tried to do is drawn a false equivalence between the saboteurs and the victims, and it's an absurdity, it seems to me. And I think we need to call. Look, there's useful commentary within the Forde Report is acknowledge that anti-Semitism was weaponized, but to try and say that there were two factions equally using anti-Semitism is absolutely absurd. I mean, just, and I suspect that maybe that's one of the reasons why the report was delayed. I suspect there was a real operation going on behind the scenes to try and, rescue something for the Labour Party establishment, as it were, so that they could maybe draw something out of it, so that it wasn't a complete, demolition job of the way the Labour Party operates. I mean, the Labour Party is completely broken. Let's be honest about it. And in my opinion, there is no way back. And I think, trying to, fight that battle it's a wasted energy, really. And I think we'd be far better trying to build an alternative movement, an alternative political movement, and an alternative grassroots movement. That is, I think, our salvation. And I've just provided some commentary on a book that's about to come out about the poll tax struggle. And that demonstrated that even in a hostile political environment, grassroots solidarity, working class solidarity, can deliver significant political change. The mistake, I think, of the poll tax campaign was that we didn't then, build on that. We got the poll tax scrap, got rid of Thatcher, but then that campaign dissipated, and that was a real shame, really, because I think perhaps maybe people were putting too much hope in New Labour that there was some salvation there, and we know clearly there wasn't. They were just, as I've said, enthralled to maybe even more so than the Tories to corporate capitalism and to the military-industrial complex.
Some people might say that there's still more socialists, far more socialists within the Labour Party than in all the different groups of on the left. Is that your battery going off? I think it might have been. Okay, you might join us again later. I'm going to bring in Marc Wadsworth. Thank you for joining us, one of the more famous victims of the witch hunt. Hello, comrade. You were obviously you were expelled. We've all been on your side and fought against it. You've seen maybe Leah talking about the hierarchy of racism that she perceives as, which is also mentioned in the report, and it's all got a whole section of the misogyny and racism that comrades members supplied evidence on. Do you think can you do away with racism in a party that reflects society and a capitalist society where racism is an integral part of its structure?
We expect the Labour Party, which proclaims itself the party of social justice and anti-racism, to be better than a mere reflection of society. It seeks to be in government and to represent all parts of society, including African, Caribbean, Asian, and other people of colour. And this report strips bare the fact that, as it says, the deeply toxic and unpleasant culture in the Labour Party that allows racism from senior officials to go unchallenged. The response to it from the Labour leadership and much of the media exemplifies the problem. I don't think most journalists have read the report, and they've ignored quite a chunky section that exposes the racism that is being faced. But did the inquiry panel even bother to go to headquarters in Victoria Street and just take a look around, as I have, when I was being persecuted by the witch hunters of the NCC, the National Constitutional Committee, and I'd end up in a committee room here and there, and you possibly, if you were lucky, see one black person in the open plan office, normally sitting by the door or pushing a tea trolley. I mean, this is in the middle of London, which has, some argue, a majority people of colour, and a black mayor in Sadiq Khan. We're just not represented in the party among the senior officials at region, at national level. I think today, out of 39 Labour National Executive Committee members, just one is African Caribbean, Carol Sewell, who's actually a right winger, handpicked. So this is the problem we've got. You know, in Lotto, the leader's office, how many of the advisors were black? How many of John McDonnell or Jeremy Corbyn's advisors were black? And when I say black, I mean African Caribbean, Asian, and people of color. And comrades will know that if they look at that 60-second clip that resulted in me being expelled from the Labour Party in June 2016, the Chakrabarti Report launch, which my organization, Black Caucus organization, made a submission to, the main thrust of what I said, apart from the bit about a Labour MP who was working hand in hand with a Daily Telegraph reporter, was look around this room. How many African, Caribbean and Asian people are here? We must do better. This is the launch of a report that is supposed to be examining racism in the Labour Party. And the black people simply aren't here. And so anti-black racism, Islamophobia, marginalized, ignored. We saw the appalling abuse that Diane Abbott received online, and how Labour officials at head office in their WhatsApp group mocked her to the point where she had to run away to a toilet and cry. They mocked that. Clive Lewis is mocked. Absana Begum is now facing a trigger ballot to get her out, because her only crime being that she's black, Muslim, and a left winger. So, you know, you just need the anecdotal evidence plus the scientific evidence of the stats and the data to show that we have a real problem, and Labour doesn't deserve the support it gets from black voters in more than 100 seats that it can't get into government without the support of. It doesn't deserve that unless there's a root and branch change. The racists need to be rooted out at head office, at region, at party official level, and the party needs to start to begin to look and represent politically, in terms of socialism and anti-racism and internationalism, the population at large.
I mean, Martin Forde, he does recognize that there are hardly any black staff members, etc. He puts it down again to the factional war that's been going on. It's got a certain point, I guess. He's been describing that since before Blair, even regional staff, all the staff has been recruited by right-wingers from their own networks. You know, there's no open application process in most cases. It's people going back to their own universities, recruiting their friends and networks, and you get a cabal of people who are, you know, acting against the membership, really. Do you think the kind of cultural growth they're talking about in this report can make a difference to that at all? Or is it not a reflection of the, you know, the class war between the left and the right in the Labour Party?
Well, I don't want to do a plug all the time, but follow me on Twitter, because I am pushing genuine grassroots anti-racism through this new anti-racist black-led initiative, the Liberation Movement. I'll put it in the chat. And also, you know, we need insurgency We need extra parliamentary activity. We need to support striking workers. There needs to be rebellion in the workplace, in our communities, support for Black Lives Matter type movements like the Liberation Movement, Extinction Rebellion, the Sarah Everard people. The fight is now outside. The Labour Party is a pale reflection of the Conservatives. We're now going to have probably a pound shop Margaret Thatcher as the new leader of the Conservative Party, and the battle. I mean, what has the Socialist Campaign Group had to say about the Forde Report so far? Does anybody know?
I've not seen anything. Not that they say anything about anything.
Chris, do you know, are they vocal, your former comrades in the...
I don't think so, Mark. They will be running for cover, I suspect, as they have done ever since the whole anti-Semitism, well, scam, reared its ugly head.
So, Mark, what is the key lesson for you from your experience in the last 7 years?
The key lesson is that we are not going to get salvation, sadly.
Is that your...
Yeah, I've switched it off. Yeah,
thank you.
We're not going to get salvation through even the Socialist Campaign Group in Parliament. The struggles return to where it belongs, which is outside Parliament, where women's rights were won, the civil rights movement progress was made, gay rights were won, and we're fighting on so many levels on the international stage for justice. And Forde just reinforces that. And isn't it interesting that the Labour Party, whenever it's been in trouble on these matters, has chosen a black person to attempt to get it out of trouble? Shami Chakrabarti with the Chakrabarti report, and now Martin Forde. So they're the fall guys. The same like with the Tory party and the African, Caribbean and Asian people that it puts up as exemplars of its diversity, when we know that they're not. In fact, they fall into the category of the sort of collaborators during colonialism and slavery who took us backwards as a race rather than forwards.
Thank you very much, Mark. I want to bring in Graham Bash, the former editor of Labour Briefing, who's got a slightly different view on is the Labour Party dead or not, and I think that's what you wanted to speak about.
No, it isn't actually.
Oh, it is? No, go on.
I'm fed up discussing this with Chris, to be honest. I just want to cheer us up. The thing that cheered me up most today was the Jewish Chronicle. Usually cheers me up. Just read this. I'll read it out. 3 letters render the Forde Report into the leaking of a Labour document on anti-Semitism worthless. Those 3 letters are JVL. Any claim the report might otherwise have to be a serious contribution to the ongoing debate over Labour anti-Semitism is nullified by the proposal that Jewish Voice for Labour, a group set up by Corbynites solely to push the idea that the party didn't have a problem with anti-Semitism, should now be responsible for training in anti-Semitism. JVL should be prescribed, not embraced. So that shows whatever the limits of the Forde Report, it says something about it. But actually, I don't quite agree with some of the comrades. Really, a number of excellent contributions. I'm not sure it's that clever. I mean, this is purist liberalism. It reminds me when I was at school, about age 15, in our English class, we were discussing this play called Strife. And the point was there was an intransigent employer and there was an intransigent trade union leader in conflict. And he put an equal sign between them. So between oppressed and oppressor, between the establishment and those fighting back, there's an equal sign. Yeah, it's as clever as it can be, but it really isn't clever. And I suppose at least thank you everybody for telling me why I was expelled after 53 or 4 years, whatever it was. I now know I'm an anti-Zionist Jew, I'm a communist, and I'm a Trotskyist. So, well, that's good to know. At least
and a denialist probably as well.
A denialist as well. So that's a good reason. But look, it's got some real nuggets which we should get out of it and quote and quote and quote. the attacks on administrative suspensions, the showing that there was a real factional bias from the right in weaponising anti-Semitism. All of those things is as good as it could be, but really it's so flawed. The very premise of it is wrong. But let's use it for what we can. But I'm afraid that very soon this will be history, and we've got to move into struggle. And the one thing I do agree with what was said about the Labour Party is this, that the main struggle for the immediate and foreseeable future is outside. It's to build the resistance. That's happening at the moment. And we've got to give it a political expression. Whether that can be in the Labour Party or whether it won't be is something that I think is we will be seen in the process of the near future. I haven't given up on it yet, like Chris. You may be proved right, Chris. I'm not sure. But I don't think we should pronounce the patient dead until it's actually stopped breathing. You think it stopped breathing 2 years ago. I think it's just very ill. But look, that's another issue. But today, we're discussing the Forde Report. Let's all read the Jewish Chronicle and cheer ourselves up.
Yes, there is something to be said of the JLM being annoyed about something. There must be something good in it. Comrade, what is the sort of the key lesson that you've drawn from, and you've been very involved in the Corbyn movement as well. I mean, John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn have been friends of yours when this whole thing started. Yeah. How is it going?
Firstly, I would always temper any criticisms of John and Jeremy, though I make them, and strongly, to recognise the balance of forces they were facing, the full threat of the establishment. And the lesson is this: they could only have won by mobilising the strength of the Labour movement in a period where the Labour movement actually wasn't strong. So there was the problem for them. But they could only have won by relying on the forces, building up extra parliamentary forces. And that they failed to do. And they failed partly for subjective reasons, because of the open selection, because they allowed so many of us to be collateral damage. But they also lost because the forces from below were hardly mobilising like they say were 30, 40, 50 years ago in the Benite period. So it's easier said than done. And I agree with so many of the criticisms of what we could have done, not played the parliamentary game. That's the key thing. We could never have won from within Parliament, because actually the parliamentary party represented the establishment wing. They were the direct representatives of the establishment. And any idea that you could carry out a socialist programme with the support of the Parliamentary Labour Party without fundamentally transforming it was an illusion that actually I think some of the my comrades actually probably kidded themselves was their best chance. Mm. But whatever we did, the odds were always against us. But key mistakes along those lines were the ones that were made.
How about, I mean, the report does go into some lengths to explain how, I mentioned this before, how regional offices were staffed with right-wingers and had been for decades, not from before Blair, but certainly since Blair. There was no neutrality or anything. They were chosen because they had a political agenda which fitted the party bureaucracy. I mean, surely if we should ever get into a position similar to this, clearing out the bureaucracy must be, which is what Starmer's been doing and attacking the left, but clearing out the bureaucracy must be surely top of the agenda as well.
I think Starmer and Evans should be our role model. When they're down, kick them. That's a good old socialist slogan. And we were too nice. We were too appeasing. I'm not sure, had we done everything that Chris, Tony, me and others have said, we would have won. But at least perhaps we would have had a legacy, a left, which could have carried the struggle forward. And at the moment, I actually think the left is in a worse position than at any time I've at any time for the last 54 years.
That's the key question, isn't it? Where do we go from here? I've seen it in the chat, and I think there's as many views on that here on the panel, or if not more out there, different views on moving forward. I wonder if any of the panelists want to reply to anything. I'm gonna bring you all in now into the panel so we can see you all. You're all still here. If anybody wants to say something, raise your hand, reply anything that's been said. Otherwise, I think we've had a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion about much of the report. Touched on a few things. I'm sure there's actually, the more you read it, you'll find little nuggets that are worthwhile discussing some more. Okay, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, I take on board the point that Graham and others have made, that there are useful nuggets in this. And of course, the Jewish Chronicle, which really represents the far right of the Zionist movement in this country, it quotes extensively from the campaign against anti-Semitism, which is now, I think, on the fringe of the Zionist movement in a sense. Yes, there are takeaway points that we can find useful, but the overall balance of the report is to reinforce the Starmer project. I don't think there's any doubt of that. And they also do dissociate themselves, if not criticise Jeremy Corbyn for saying anti-Semitism was overstated. And I think that is the key finding of this report. It does find that the anti-Semitism was a genuine phenomena in the Labour Party. For all the things it says about weaponisation and so on, it does lend credence to the idea that somehow anti-Semitism sprang up out of nowhere as soon as Corbyn was elected. And that is something that the right will take home with it. The rest of it will, of course, be ignored. The idea that JVL can offer anti-Semitism training is not going to be implemented, and I don't think anyone thinks that it will, for obvious reasons. And of course, that's a red rag to the Jewish Chronicle, and it's gone to town over that, as has the Jewish labour movements and so on. But at the end of the day, nothing that the report says will change the fact that Jewish people have been expelled in droves after Starmer took power. And it has nothing to say on that. It has no observations about that. It doesn't ask questions as to how come it is that if you're fighting anti-Semitism, you're expelling Jews. I mean, if you were saying that you were going to combat Islamophobia, and the next thing that happened was that thousands of Muslims were expelled from the Labour Party, people would ask questions, and yet it doesn't ask any questions. And of course, it doesn't comment on the fact that racists like Trevor Phillips have been reinstated quietly and surreptitiously, which therefore throws into doubt, to say the least, Labour's commitment to anti-racism, bearing in mind that the Labour Party today is going along with all the immigration proposals of the Tory party, or simply questioning them on the grounds of cost, like the Rwandan deportations and so on. So I mean, Labour is has a moral vacuum at its heart, because it really can't cope with anti-racism seriously.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. I think that's an important point, that the report simply accepts that there is a huge problem of anti-Semitism, which is a weaponization of anti-Semitism as well, of a reflection of it, without proving any evidence at all. Reederwan, please.
I think that the report is good enough as a tool around which to organize within the Labour Party. And if we do not take what it does say seriously and organize a structured set of demands and a program of action within the Labour Party, we're wasting our time here. Because it says JVL, that Jewish labor movement training program on anti-Semitism, is just propaganda. That's what it ultimately says. So the thing to do is, as our brother Graham had indicated, Jewish Chronicle is institutionally resistant to it. So it makes sense for the left, whether you're in the Labour Party or not in the Labour Party, to support those who will make the demand and make the push for that anti-Semitism training program to include JVL. The same with these issues of this white space called the Labour Party bureaucracy. Take the issues that he raises and translate them into concrete demands and organize a program around it. Otherwise, we're just having stomach cramps here. Because the key thing is we must take it with the limitations that the report has, make a political issue out of it. And I can list a number of issues, but that's the basic thing. Take it because the issue is the Labour Party is an important arena of struggle for social democracy. Everything else, this Forde report is not the 18 Brumaire by Karl Marx. This is just a comment on some problems in the Labour Party. So the key issue is, let us be serious. The limitations of the Labour Party are known, agreed by people here. Take what it says, because if the right wing had a report like this, they would run rings around Evans and Keir Starmer. We want to likely say, oh, this report is, oh, we can do nothing, the Labour Party is irredeemable, and so on and so forth. So basically, there are things that can be done. If we are serious, let's do it. If we are even more serious, let us build a revolution outside the Labour Party, outside Parliament, and take over that place before they refurbish it.
Refurbish it, yeah. Thank you, comrade. I think that's a good position. Is inside, fighting inside and outside. Inside, if you can. I mean, I think all of us, with your exclusion, have been expelled already. So there's very few lefties left. Asa, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that the interesting thing about the Forde Report is that by my count, this is the 6th report on Labour anti-Semitism, quote unquote.
That's how serious a problem it is.
Yeah, I mean, and every single time, and I've read them all. It's hard. I mean, it's easy to forget that. We were just going through them before we went live. The very first one was there was a report by Labour students, which was never published, but I did obtain it a couple of years ago, and I published some of it. I mean, it was a libelous document, so I couldn't publish it all, but I did publish some extracts of it, and I mean, that was so factional, it was ridiculous, and it was written by Michael Rubin, who's now the director of Labour Friends of Israel, and is seen in the Al Jazeera documentary from 2017 saying that, essentially admitting that Labour Friends of Israel is a front for the Israeli embassy. And this is where it all started. It was all in Oxford University Labour Club. This was really where it spiraled from. And that was really the starting point of all these reports and investigations. So you had that. Then we had the Jan Royal, which did publish at least its conclusions, not the whole document. And then we had Chakrabarti. Now, Chakrabarti also included Jan Royal, so that's 3 documents. And then we had the EHRC investigation, and we had the leaked Labour document, which was ostensibly pro-Corbyn, but as we've talked about, was just accepted the false premise that there was a unique problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and as Tony was saying, did not put forward any evidence that the main people it was accusing of anti-Semitism were actually anti-Semitic. It was just accepting that what Jackie Walker said was anti-Semitic. It was just accepting without evidence that what Chris did was anti-Semitic and what Mark said was anti-Semitic. There was no, it was just an assumption. And Forde so that makes Forde the 6th. And they all just accept that as a premise. And this is really, and that is really the fundamental weakness of it. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's in a it's kind of in a long tradition of British imperialism, really, all these reports, because they're all sort of white papers, you know, royal commissions, or these kind of pretense. It's all part of a pretense of, you know, being apolitical jurists that are kind of, you know, the mature people in the room, and that the Labour Party is trying to fit within that kind of mold, and I think that we shouldn't expect too much from it. But nonetheless, you know, I do agree we could take from it. There are things that we can make out of it, and I think the admission that the right weaponized anti-Semitism, I think it is significant.
Thank you, Asa. Yeah, it's quite interesting that the report goes through some lengths to say, oh, we need more neutral, politically neutral people working for the party, and, you know, it should all be culture of growth, etc., talking to each other, completely ignoring, you know, it's not a company, it's a political party where people struggle for, you know, how to change society, how to overthrow capitalism, etc., and you get neutral people involved. It's rubbish. It's a reflection of the class war.
And it's not even true, because none of these people are neutral, as much as they're trying to present themselves as that in that way.
Impossible to be neutral on these things. Anyway, Chris, please.
I mean, I guess even if we were to succeed, as other speakers have talked about, fighting to ensure that the better parts of the Forde Report were implemented, what would we be inheriting? I mean, of course, it was never anything to do with anti-Semitism anyway. But what would we be achieving? We would be achieving the ability to maybe have some sort of say in a political party that's just a husk of its former self. I mean, at the end of the day, even if we were to address this issue of anti-Semitism and to get the Labour Party to accept that it's the fraud that it really is, the Labour Party is not a forum for social democracy, let alone socialism. The Labour Party is committed to neoliberalism and has been in reality for over 40 years, ever since Dennis Healey went to the IMF, and it's just been turbocharged ever since. So is it really the forum to wage the class struggle? I don't think it is. It actually is the class enemy. That's why I say we should be fighting the Labour Party. We should be seeking to destroy, crush the Labour Party, to hasten the Pesocification of the Labour Party. I mean, I think if people want to put any effort into anything associated with the Labour Party, it should be in encouraging the trade unions that they're members of to disaffiliate, defund and disaffiliate, and help us to, create an alternative, help us to build a grassroots movement outside the Labour Party, because we're just throwing good money after bad. I mean, talk about banging your head against a brick wall. How much evidence do we need to see to realise that it is a busted flush, that we are really never going to get anywhere in terms of, addressing the fundamental challenges that are facing this country, that are facing in terms of, climate catastrophe, the class struggle, the endemic insecurity, poverty, the meltdown of our public services. We're not going to achieve any of that in terms of addressing that through the Labour Party. And let's remember, inequality, even when the economy was in a better shape than perhaps it is now, although it is still the world's fifth biggest, inequality under the last so-called Labour government actually increased. I know Gordon Brown, he always talks about taking kids out of poverty, but I mean, at the end of the day, they were introducing socialism for the rich. They were subsidising bad employers, as we know, and continuing to allow good quality jobs to be offshored, continuing to allow privatisation to flourish and expand, continuing to actually ensure that there was further deregulation. They did nothing about the deregulation of the housing market. In fact, they built less houses, less council houses, fewer council houses than the Conservatives did under Margaret Thatcher. It's astonishing. So I just say to people, what is it that you're seeking to achieve through the Labour Party? I understand that kind of emotional attachment to it. I was a member of it for 42 years, for God's sake. I was defined by the Labour Party, but there does come a time. I mean, it really is an abusive relationship, I think, that people are in with the Labour Party. Socialists, people, even Social Democrats, actually, who think the Labour Party is a forum to bring any meaningful change. It just ain't going to happen, comrades. So use your time and energy and effort to get the trade unions to, to stop throwing good money after bad. Frankly, I can't understand why any trade union is associated with the Labour Party today. When they won't support the rail workers, they won't support the teachers, they won't support any industrial action by workers. And our only means, it seems to me, of making any real change now is through grassroots action. And as I say, to be inspired, as I was saying, I think before my battery died, take inspiration from that struggle from 30 years ago, the poll tax struggle. Change can be brought about from outside of Parliament, and indeed all the change really that's ever been introduced in Parliament has only happened, I think, as a result of pressure from below. And I think that's where we should be concentrating our effort, not wasting time on a party that's dead. It's the Norwegian blue parrot from the Monty Python sketch. It is a dead parrot, comrades, nailed to the perch. That's it.
Thank you, Chris. I think, you certainly, there's a point looking at the left around the Labour Party. It looks pretty dire. It doesn't look so much more attractive looking at the left outside the Labour Party, I have to say.
I agree. Let's build something better then.
There's about 20 organisations with a very similar soft left.
Yeah, we need to come together. We need to bring the left together. That's what we need to understand. That there's a Labour movement maxim, isn't there, Tina, that unity is strength, but the left is hopeless at actually demonstrating unity.
And perhaps that's to do with the PR system as well.
We need to be campaigning for that as well. People like Arthur Scargill were well ahead of their time when they were calling for it, in the 1970s and before.
Yeah, well,
and that's we need to be doing that. It seems to me, get involved in some meaningful struggles.
Yeah,
not wasting the time with the bloody Norwegian blue parrot.
As long as we have that electoral system and the unions are affiliated, though perhaps an active approach to both the Labour Party as well as the struggle to build a principled socialist, not a soft left, a principled socialist, Marxist left perhaps even, I think are both key tasks. But I'm just chairing, so I'll shut up. Kevin.
Thanks, comrades. Just a very brief point. I'm glad the discussion's taken the turn that it has, because I think in some ways the real point about this report is not the actual details of it, much of which we knew or we suspected, or indeed that we get sort of too drawn into just arguing within the frames of the report. I think the issues that are thrown up are about the nature of the Labour Party, which I made in my original contribution, and in particular what the Forde Report doesn't mention. And again, comrades in the last round have all sort of mentioned that quite well. Asa's point about the sort of studied neutrality, I think is useful there. And I must say I congratulate Graham's English teacher teaching Goldsworthy. The last time I taught that was to undergraduates, Graham, so you've done very well to remember it. But I think it is important, that idea that comes out in this report, that they're all bad as one another. But I just want to throw my pennyworth in and also do a bit of a plug for something that some comrades, both who are on this call and elsewhere, at the Labour Party conference, where, and other comrades will be involved as well, we're organising a series of discussions called Beyond the Fringe, the Future of the Left. And I think all the comrades agree that the left is in a dire state. I think we all agree that the possibilities of Labour as an instrument for socialism are non-existent, but we also see that the alternatives outside of Labour, indeed the ones that are being attempted now, are the ones that have been attempted in the past. So I think we do need that discussion, and we do need to draw the lessons of this report and the reasons why it was created, and indeed the failure of particular types of Labour leftism to really confront not just a pro-establishment leadership, but actually people who are integral parts of the ruling class. Keir Starmer isn't just someone who differs from me politically. He's actually an outright enemy. He's as much an enemy as the Tories are. And he's probably even a more establishment part of the ruling class than most Tories. I'm not getting into conspiracy theories, but where all the powerful elements of the state and so on are found. There you'll find Keir Starmer. Now, the point is that Labour is a contradictory party, and, you know, I've also been in that abusive relationship, Chris, and I'm also recovering from it too. But I think we can't just, I think, abandon the Labour Party. It is, in a way, both an area where we can still fight, but it's also a big obstacle. And I don't think that, you know, I think Graham's point about its death is very much exaggerated. It's in a very bad way. And I think we have to confront it. We have to confront its leadership. But above all, we have to confront the sort of politics. And I don't think we can just simply turn our backs on it. But I hope the comrades here, both if they're in Liverpool for the party conference, but also online, will take part in our discussions, because I think, you know, that the future of the left is an important topic. And some of the views that I've heard this evening, I think, certainly pose ways forward. But I think it's only through discussion and particularly confronting the different perspectives, and particularly confronting that leadership and those sorts of ideas which are still dominant in our movement, that we can go forward. Anyway, thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Kevin. Graham.
Oh, Chris, honestly, you undermine your own argument, mate. When you say that the Labour Party's been neoliberal since the days of Blair and Brown, well, the logic is you should have left then. But you didn't, and neither did I. And for all its faults, because we stayed in, we got Corbyn and McDonnell for all their faults. So that's not a really good argument to say that we should have left 40 years ago. If we'd have left 40 years ago, we should have left when Ramsay MacDonald sold us out in 1939. Why didn't you leave then, Chris? That's what I want to know. I mean, seriously, this argument that also this accusation that we've got an emotional commitment to the Labour Party. Well, again, to most of the Labour Party, I'll be honest with you, I do. I have very strong emotions, but it's hate. And it's always been that way. And sometimes we've got to do the difficult thing. And I'm not very interested in being in small groups where everyone agrees. It's nice, it's really nice, but it's a bit beside the point. And I take the point that Reederwan made. He actually said, when struggle means having to undergo some pain. And nothing really in my lifetime has been more painful than being in the Labour Party, if I'm blunt. But you have to do it until we get to a point where it becomes impossible. Now, I concede this, and it really is important. This isn't just business as usual. It's not necessarily the same as Blair. It could be worse, because debate, freedom of expression is being smashed. And it may well be that we reach the conclusion that there is no future in the Labour Party. It may be that, but it's quite possible, even likely, if Truss wins the Tory party leadership, that Labour could well be in government. And then we will see, if that happens, a possible explosion between the growing resistance in the trade union movement and ever-right moving Labour government. And when that happens, we've got to be at the intersection of that conflict and not being way apart from it, beautifully happy in the fact that we're talking to people of a like mind. That isn't the point. We need, I'm afraid, we've undergone lots of pain. I'm afraid there's a lot more to come, comrade.
Well, I'm not suggesting that, Graham. What I'm suggesting is that we build. I'm not talking about, you know, some sort of cozy little set where we all agree with each other. I'm talking about building a mass movement outside the Labour Party. And the difference today to, you know, the days of Blair and company in the last 40 years is that we've been through the Corbyn experience. We've been through a situation where we built a mass membership. We got a left-wing leader. That's what I was always arguing for in those dark days of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. I didn't obviously support them. I didn't agree with the direction of the party. I contented myself in what I was trying to achieve at a local level as, well, chair of housing and then leader of the council in Derby. I think we did some good things in trying to keep the flame of municipal socialism alive. And I was always urging people at that point in time, I used to say, look, I know the Labour Party is shit, but join it and help us to change it. Because I naively thought it was a democratic party. And if we could build a mass movement, if we could get a mass membership, then we could change it. Well, we got that mass movement. We got a left-wing leader, and we still couldn't control the bloody party. Now, that is down in large measure, I think, to mistakes that were made by well, whether it's mistakes or, but certainly decisions that were taken by leadership, by the Socialist Campaign Group, who didn't actually fight. You know, they walked away from the field, they surrendered, they capitulated, and maybe, you know, we may have got further had they actually fought their corner. It would have been difficult, as you say, Graham. We might not have got there, but at least we would have been left with some legacy. I agree with you on that point. But I think there's a real difference between, you know, where we are now, where we were before. And I think it's a bit of a cheap shot, if I might say that, comrade, to say, well, why didn't you leave the Labour Party when Tony Blair was the leader? You know, that wasn't the point. I did think, like you still seem to be clinging to this Norwegian blue parrot that's nailed to the perch, that, you know, there was some potential future for the Labour Party. We had still the likes of Tony Benn in the Labour Party. There was a functioning, I think, left in the Labour Party. We had some good left-wing trade union leaders, including for a period of the time, of course, people like Arthur Scargill. So, you know, a lot of us did still think that there was a potential for the Labour Party. But for God's sake, the light of experience has demonstrated to us, Graham, that we've been through this situation of the Corbyn project, the mass membership, the left-wing leader, as I keep saying, and we didn't do it. Now, do you think we ever got the right, having mistakenly allowed a left-winger to get onto the ballot, to become the leader, and then to inspire people? That's ever going to be possible in the future? There's certainly not in our lifetimes, Graham. I don't think anybody's lifetime. So my point is, let's work together to build a credible alternative, not a kind of cosy set where we all agree with each other. Of course not. The Labour Party was guilty of that to a large extent. And another point I used to always be making is that we need to be reaching out to people who don't vote. They're the biggest cohort in every election. And that's what we should be doing. And that's what I was hoping. Through the Democracy Review, I was arguing that the regional officers that everybody's been so critical of should be, well, actually, I was suggesting if we shut them down, we wouldn't actually miss them. It would be, not only would we not miss them, they'd be positive benefit. But I was saying we should change their terms of reference to political engagement with the constituency Labour parties, political education, growing CLPs. That should be one task. And the second task is community organising in working class communities. That's what we should have been doing. But we never ever did any of that stuff, even when we got Jeremy as the leader. So having gone through that experience, been burnt by that experience, seeing good comrades thrown under the bus left, right and centre, even icons of the Labour movement like Ken Livingstone, who's now seen as a pariah by the Labour Party. We've got to, in my opinion, get real and use the considerable energy which has been, articulated tonight on building something different. We did it in the past, Graham. We did it 120 years ago. And we can do it again, and that's my plea to people. So please don't say, oh, you should have left when Tony Blair was around, because that was when the neoliberalism was sort of in its pomp. Well, there isn't a logic. There's not a logical point, is it? Because we haven't gone through the Corbyn experience, then, have we?
Not that I'm not enjoying this.
Let's continue to have this discussion for the next 20 years, Chris.
I think we're going to have that discussion in Liverpool for the next time, which is something that Kevin raised. It's an important issue. If you can come along, it will also be on Zoom. But if you can come to Liverpool, it would be great. We're certainly living in very fluid times, and things can change very, very quickly. A new left could be formed very quickly, like that. There's, the Margaret Thatcher Tribute Act might become the Prime Minister. There's industrial struggles, cost of living crisis, while profits are going through the roof. It's certainly fluid times. Now Tony's put his hand up. Okay, Tony, 1 minute, please.
Yeah, I think both Graham and Chris have valid points in a sense that, yes, it was right to stay in during the Blair years, although most of us didn't. But I think we also have to recognise that there has now been a qualitative change, and that is that the defeat of Corbyn is probably a final defeat because of the reaction of the Labour right, aided by the capitalist class. What we've seen, the witch hunt under Starmer, is qualitatively and quantitatively different from that under Blair, Kinnock or anyone else. I remember the Kinnock witch hunt because I was suspended under it, and that pales into comparison. And the fact is that under Starmer, they have now moved to a hard right position, which even outflanks Tony Blair, bad as it was. So I think we do have to recognise that situations change. The question is how we overcome that and how we build outside of the party, but I don't believe we can simply ignore people in the party either. So we do have to have a twin track approach. Okay, thank you.
I agree with Tony. Look at
Just
that.
like Gerald Ford there.
Even-handed.
And actually, Tony's point was agreeing with me. He said he agreed with Bo Kramer, but the point I was making is it was right to stop him, and it's a busted flush now. So,
comrades, I think we've made the point that this approach of zero tolerance and no platforming each other is the wrong approach, and we agree with Forde on that for sure. It's, I think, a key issue that we should take away from that document, that John McDonnell and his comrades were very wrong to argue for zero tolerance. What we need is actually a democratic culture of the left where we discuss differences. They're not a problem, are they? We've got different views, so we can still be in the same organization arguing those different views.
Who argued for, originated the zero tolerance? It was Rudy Giuliani in New York. It's always been a racist concept from its very beginnings.
Well, racist and very undemocratic, isn't it? It is designed to shut debate and not have a very democratic culture, whereas we on the left certainly need a democratic culture, and I think we've shown it tonight that we can have differences and move together forward, perhaps in the same organization at some stage. There'll be lots of arguments about what kind of program, Marxist or social democratic, lots of interesting discussions to come. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight. I thought it was a very wide-ranging and very interesting discussion, and to be continued, no doubt. Bye-bye, comrades.
Bye.
yes.
Solidarity.
Bye, comrades.